Ranger had not eaten in 4 days. The Belgian Malinois pressed against the back wall of his kennel at Clearwater Animal Haven in Bozeman, Montana, and watched everyone who passed his door with the hollow patience of a dog who had stopped expecting anything. His ribs showed through a dust-colored coat that should have carried 30 more pounds. A full bowl of food sat untouched in the corner, growing stale. The behaviorist who came on Thursdays wrote grief response in her notes and added a question mark, because even she wasn't sure an animal could grieve hard enough to die from it. Then a former Navy SEAL named Grant Ives walked through the front door on a cold Tuesday in November, asking about a Beagle puppy. Grant had come with a list. He had one specific purpose and one hard boundary around anything with a Malinois' bone structure or a working dog's dark markings. 48 hours later, Ranger carried something out of the farmhouse that left 2 people standing on a frost-covered porch without a single word between them, and it was not a toy, not a leash, and not anything Grant would have predicted when he'd driven in from the meadow that morning. Before we go further, tell us the city you're watching from in the comments below. And if stories like this matter to you, please subscribe to Paws of Courage for more. Grant Ives was 53 years old and had spent 22 years in the Navy before his knees and his patients finally told him it was finished. He lived alone on 11 acres of high-grass meadow outside Bozeman, a gray-planked farmhouse set far enough from the road that he could not see passing headlights from his bedroom window. He had chosen the property for that reason. He was a broad man, still carrying the muscle of someone trained for difficult and unrepeatable things. With short, dark hair, going the color of weathered pine at the temples, and the deliberate way of moving through a room that stays with people, long after the thing that taught it is gone. His wife, Miriam, had picked the farmhouse. She'd driven out on a gray Saturday in March and walked to the back fence line, looked at the Bridger Range, and said this is the one before they'd even gone inside. She had dark hair and quick hands and a laugh that sounded like something she'd genuinely found funny, rather than something politely performed. She had died 18 months ago. The kind of death that gives a person just enough time to say the important things, and not nearly enough time to finish saying them. Grant had also lost a dog in Kandahar 9 years before that. A Belgian Malinois named Ajax, compact and dark-faced and so quick that watching him work sometimes felt like watching water move. Ajax had pushed Grant out of a doorway. Grant hadn't fully cleared and taken the pressure plate impact that had been meant for him. Grant had held Ajax for 11 minutes before the dog's chest went still. He had not spoken Ajax's name to another person since. His daughter Abby, who lived in Denver and called more often than Grant returned the calls, had found the listing herself. A Beagle mix, 8 weeks old, already named by the shelter. Just go look, Dad. She had her mother's directness. Grant had written the shelter address on the back of an envelope and driven the 40 minutes into town on a Tuesday morning when the sky was the flat pewter that Montana gets in November, just before the first serious snow. Clearwater Animal Haven sat on the east side of Bozeman in a low brick building with a gravel lot and a chain-link perimeter that had seen better decades. The lobby smelled of disinfectant and animal warmth and the particular mix of hope and resignation that all shelters carry in equal measure. A hand-lettered sign above the front desk read, "Every dog here has a story. Some are just harder to read." The woman at the desk was Faye Caldwell, who had run Clearwater for 19 years and had the compact, sure-footed presence of someone who had made difficult decisions for long enough that she no longer needed to announce them. She was 64, with silver hair cut bluntly at her jaw and dark eyes that took in the room before most people knew they'd been seen. She looked at Grant for a moment in the particular way. She looked at people who came through the door, carrying something they hadn't put down yet. "The Beagle is ready," she said. "Before we head back, could I show you one other dog first?" Grant's expression did not change. "Is there a problem with the puppy?" "Nah, he's healthy and waiting." Faye set down her pen. "This is about a different animal." She led him past the puppy wing down a quieter corridor where the air was cooler, and the sounds of other dogs felt farther away. She stopped at a door with a narrow observation panel and stood beside it without reaching for the handle. "His name is Ranger," she said. He came to us 9 days ago. He's 4 years old, a Belgian Malinois, and he belonged to a man named Leonard Price. Leonard was 71. Retired Army, lived alone off Bridger Canyon Road. His neighbors said he'd been withdrawing for a couple years, since his wife passed. Ranger was the reason he got up in the mornings. Grant looked through the glass. The Malinois was pressed against the back wall, knees folded beneath him, coat dull from weight loss. His amber eyes were fixed on the kennel door with the specific patience of an animal who had given up on the door opening the right way and was simply watching it because there was nothing else to watch. Leonard died at home, Faye continued. Animal Control found Ranger beside the chair. He'd been there for almost 3 days. He let them put a lead on him, but he's refused almost everything since. He watches every person who passes, and when they leave, he goes back to that wall. Grant did not answer right away. The report listed him as potentially aggressive. He snapped at the air once when a handler reached too fast. Faye paused. That's not what I see when I watch him. What do you see? She was quiet for a moment. A dog waiting for something that isn't coming back. Grant looked at Ranger through the glass and felt the particular discomfort of seeing something in another creature you have spent a long time trying not to see in yourself. The Malinois had the same compact shoulders as Ajax, the same way of holding weight low when uncertainty was present. Grant had spent 9 years teaching himself to stop making that comparison. I came for the Beagle, he said. I know. He stepped back from the panel. He knew what grief looked like in a working dog's body. The locked joints, the refusal of food, the sentinel posture held past the point of endurance. Knowing it didn't mean he was the right person for it. Knowing it meant he understood exactly what he'd be walking into. He hasn't responded to anyone's voice since he arrived, Faye said. She didn't frame it as an argument. She left it the way you leave something on a table for another person to pick up or not. Grant looked at her. Then he turned back to the window. Easy, he said. Low and even, not a command, just the word. The one he'd used in 100 dark places with a dog who'd learned that Grant's voice meant the immediate threat had passed. Ranger's ears moved. Toward the sound, not toward the glass. 1 degree of rotation, barely a second's worth, before the dog's eyes returned to the kennel door. Faye did not say a word. Grant went in alone. He moved at an angle, placed a water bowl several feet from Ranger, then sat on the concrete floor, with his back partly turned and his hands open on his knees. He talked about the drive in from the meadow, about the snow that was probably coming by the weekend, about the wood stove in the farmhouse that his wife had insisted was their best purchase, and he'd thought she was wrong about until the first real Montana winter. He talked in the low, unhurried rhythm he'd used in Kandahar, because the rhythm was the message, and the words were only the vessel. After 12 minutes, he heard Ranger move. He didn't turn, he heard careful pause on concrete, then the soft, tentative sound of a tongue meeting water. 3 laps, 4, then silence. Grant pressed his palm flat against the floor and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Something that had been pulled tight in his chest released by 1 degree. He came back out into the hallway. What are the terms for a short foster? The drive back was quiet in the way Montana Highway is quiet in November, flat gray sky, frost-stiffened grass, the occasional stand of bare cottonwood along the roadside. Ranger lay folded in the secured crate on the back seat and made no sound. He did not whine at turns. He fixed his amber eyes on the crate wall and kept them there, diminished and patient. Grant checked the rearview mirror every few miles. Roads will freeze before dark, he said. Not to fill silence, because the rhythm worked even here, even now. You've got heated floors in the kitchen. Miriam had them put in. I thought it was unnecessary every year until it snowed. One of Ranger's ears turned slightly toward the sound, barely perceptible. Enough. The farmhouse looked the way it always did in November. Gray planks, darkened at the corners by rain, the vegetable garden along the south fence brown and folded under. By the front door, a wicker basket held Miriam's gardening gloves. The worn leather pair she'd used for everything from tomatoes to splitting kindling, shaped by 11 years to fit only her particular grip. Grant had not moved the basket. He had not moved a great many things. He set the crate just inside the entryway and opened its door. Ranger did not come out. He sat in the opening and looked at the unfamiliar room with the stillness of an animal who had learned that new places do not necessarily stay safe. Grant sat down on the floor, not the couch, not his chair, the floor. He left the front door ajar, giving Ranger the option of the exit, and he waited. It took 40 minutes for Ranger to step out of the crate. He moved close to the walls, kept his head low, and chose a position facing the front door. He sat with his spine straight and his ears forward, watching the entrance with the focused attention of a dog who had appointed himself to a post he hadn't been given and could not set down. Grant put food and water within reach. Ranger did not touch either. That night Grant went upstairs and lay on his back in the dark and listened through the floorboards. He lay awake until after 2, then came back down. Ranger was still at his post. His head had dropped with exhaustion, but each time his eyes began to close, he forced them open and fixed them on the door. He did not acknowledge Grant returning. He was managing something that required everything he had, and sleep was not part of the available options. Grant understood this from the inside. He sat against the sofa, with his legs stretched out and faced the door beside him. "Nothing's getting through there tonight," he said quietly. "You've got the front, I've got the floor." Ranger's ears shifted toward him. Neither slept right away, but slowly, over the next hour, Ranger's locked shoulders began to soften. His front legs slid forward, his chest lowered, his eyes closed for a moment, opened, closed again. Eventually they stayed closed. He had not approached Grant, he had not accepted touch, but he had allowed himself to sleep while another body held the watch. And for a creature who had been awake at his post for 9 days, that was not a small thing. The second day was mostly quiet. Ranger ate a few bites when Grant stepped out of the kitchen and drank when Grant sat with his back turned. Grant noted each improvement as data rather than cause for celebration, because he'd seen too many times how quickly progress collapsed when it felt like something was expected of it. By mid-afternoon, Ranger had moved from the front door to a position near the hallway where he could see both the entrance and the kitchen. He was tracking Grant with his eyes now. Not following, just noticing. Watching the particular rhythm of Grant's boots on the wooden floor, the way he set his mug down, the sequence of ordinary movements that make up the daily grammar of a house. Grant came back from the garage around 3 o'clock and found one piece of toast missing from the plate on the counter. Ranger sat 6 feet away with the carefully neutral expression of a dog who has already considered and rejected every possible connection between himself and the situation at hand. Grant looked at the plate. He looked at Ranger. Ranger examined the middle distance with great interest. 4 days without eating, Grant said, and you start with my breakfast. Ranger's tail touched the floor once, a single thump, involuntary, almost startled looking. Then he seemed to register what he'd done and went very still. It was the first movement that had nothing to do with fear. Grant turned back to the counter so Ranger wouldn't see the thing that happened to the edge of his mouth. The storm came in fast that night, the way mountain storms do in November, without announcement, just suddenly pressing against every window, and bending the cottonwoods along the drive, and filling the farmhouse with the low, persistent sound of wind, finding every seam in old wood. The power held. Grant was adding a log to the stove when a gust hit the back wall hard enough to rattle the glass and blow Miriam's small clay pot from the shelf above the fireplace. It fell and shattered against the stone hearth with a sharp, ringing crack. The sound was not especially loud, but it was sudden and metallic and rang out in the specific way that the wrong sound at the wrong moment rings out, too clean, too close, arriving in the chest before the mind has caught up. Grant heard Ajax's tags. He did not hear the clay pot. He heard the sound of metal identification tags striking a harness buckle, a sound he'd heard 10,000 times, a sound that had become, in the particular compression of grief, the sound that lived in the seconds before the 11 minutes that ended everything. The room was not the room. The fire was not the fire. He went down on one knee beside the couch without meaning to. His hand pressed against the floor. His breath came wrong. He was in a doorway in Kandahar and Ajax was ahead of him, and there was not enough time. There was never enough time. And the thing he'd told himself for 9 years was that he'd had no choice, and in these moments the choice felt enormous and irreversible and entirely his. "I'm sorry," he'd said to Ajax in the minutes after, to a dog already past hearing it. He'd said it out loud in the truck on the drive from Clearwater with Ranger in the crate, surfacing from a memory to find the words already formed on his tongue. Ranger was shaking. The sound had done to the dog something close to what it had done to Grant. His tail was tucked, his ears flat, his entire body coiled with the particular terror of a creature who knows the shape of sudden loss and has just heard something that has the shape of it again. He was the most frightened animal in the room, and he crossed the floor anyway. He took the distance in 2 slow steps and lowered his head against Grant's clenched fist. Not asking for comfort, offering presence. The instinct of one creature who knows darkness to place itself beside another creature who is standing in it right now. Grant opened his fist. He rested his palm against the side of Ranger's neck and felt the rapid, quick heartbeat there. The tremble of a dog who was frightened to his bones and had decided that staying was more important than running. "It's over," Grant said. His voice came out, stripped down to something essential, something that had been kept in a sealed room for 9 years. "You're here, it's over." He said it until his breathing evened. Ranger did not pull back. The shaking in the dog's muscles gradually quieted. They sat on the farmhouse floor while the storm worked against the windows, and the fire settled back to its ordinary sound. Grant could not have said which of them needed the other more in that moment. He suspected the answer didn't matter. Morning came clear and cold. 3 inches of new snow on the meadow, ice along the fence lines, the Bridger Range gone brilliant white against a sky that had washed itself out overnight to a hard, clean blue. Grant woke on the floor with Ranger several feet away, lying on his side with his legs loosely extended. Completely unlike any position he'd held since arriving. The posture of a dog who had decided, somewhere during the night, that vigilance could afford to wait until morning. Dr. Ingrid Sorrell arrived at 9. A tall woman of 45 with deliberate hands, and the particular patience of someone who has learned that frightened animals notice tension before humans admit to feeling it. She assessed Ranger without forcing proximity, asked Grant to cross the room while she watched the dog's eyes, and told Grant afterward that Ranger was underweight but structurally sound. Fear was one of the harder things to treat, she said. Also one of the more responsive things, given consistency, and someone who didn't leave when the work got difficult. The rehabilitation center called at 11. Transport window, tomorrow morning. Grant spent the afternoon assembling Ranger's things into the bag the shelter had provided. Medication schedule written out, feeding notes. He folded the extra blanket twice and unfolded it and refolded it and did not examine why. He put the bag by the front door and stood at the back window, looking at the snow-covered meadow for a long time. "You've been explaining this to yourself since 5 in the morning, he thought. You know what you're actually doing. He had told himself the rehabilitation center was the right choice because it had fenced yards and veterinary supervision and trained staff. He had told himself he'd done what he could in 48 hours, and that was enough. He had told himself a great many things with the same disciplined fluency he'd once used to manage fear in dark corridors, in places most people would never visit. He was still at the window when the van came up the drive. Faye stepped out from the passenger side, pulling her coat against the cold. A transport specialist named Cord Yates followed, mid-40s, careful in his movements, the kind of man who'd learned that how you approached an animal told it everything before you'd done anything yet. Grant opened the front door. Cold air moved in, and from somewhere in the back of the house, he heard Ranger's claws on the hardwood. Ranger appeared in the hallway. He looked at Grant. He looked past Faye and Cord to the transport van at the end of the drive, and something in his posture changed. Not panic, but the recognition of a pattern, the shape of a morning that ended with being somewhere else. He turned and walked back into the house. Faye and Cord waited on the porch. Grant stood in the doorway and listened. He heard Ranger move through the kitchen. He heard him stop. Then he heard the soft, deliberate sound of something lifted carefully. Not grabbed, not chewed, lifted with intention. Ranger reappeared from the hallway. He was carrying Miriam's gardening glove. the worn leather right glove from the basket by the door, the one she had used every season for 11 years, shaped by her grip until no other hand quite fit it. Grant had walked past that basket several hundred times since she died. He had not been able to explain to himself why he didn't move it, so he had stopped trying to explain and simply left it there. Ranger walked to the threshold of the front door and stopped. He looked at Grant. Then he lowered his head and placed the glove onto Grant's boot. Carefully, deliberately, the way a dog places something when offering is the only language available. Then he sat down. He was trembling. The cold was coming through the open door, and the van was visible past Grant's shoulder, and Ranger understood what vans meant. He was sitting in front of all of it, placing what he'd found at the feet of the one person whose voice had reached him through the wall, and waiting to see what happened next. Grant looked at the glove resting on his boot. The leather was worn smooth across the thumb and forefinger, creased exactly where Miriam had gripped a handle 10,000 times. He had not known a dog could say something with this kind of precision. He crouched down. Ranger flinched when Grant's hand moved toward him but did not step back. "You're not Ajax," Grant said. The name came out without the usual seizing sensation, just a name, just a fact allowed finally to exist in the open air. "You don't have to be him, you don't owe me that." He picked up the glove and held it with both hands. "But if you're choosing to stay," his voice caught for a moment. He waited until it steadied. "Then so am I." Faye pressed the back of her hand briefly to her mouth and looked at the mountains. Cord returned to the van and quietly closed the transport door without a sound. 6 months later, the high meadow outside Bozeman was green under a wide May sky, and Ranger moved through the long grass with his nose down and his ears rotating independently, which Grant had come to understand was his way of indicating that the world currently contained nothing requiring his active defense. The Malinois still flinched at sudden metallic sounds. He still tracked the door when strangers arrived, and needed more time than most dogs to determine whether a new person posed any threat. Progress had not erased what he carried. It had only taught him that what he carried did not always have to lead. Grant understood this from the inside. He still woke sometimes to the sound of Ajax's tags, still felt Kandahar in certain qualities of early morning light. But Ranger had developed a quiet routine for those nights. He would rise from his place at the foot of the bed, cross the room without being called, and rest his chin on the mattress near Grant's hand. He never barked or pawed. He simply arrived and waited, one creature who knew that particular dark, staying until the room came back. Miriam's gardening gloves had moved from the basket. They sat now on the kitchen windowsill, where the morning light came through the glass and hit the worn leather, and Grant could see them from where he drank his coffee. He'd put them there in January. He didn't examine why too closely. Some decisions were better honored than analyzed. He had also begun going to Clearwater on Wednesday mornings. At first he went to help with kennel repairs. He was good with tools and the building needed work. After a few weeks, Faye asked whether he'd sit with some of the harder cases instead, the ones that wouldn't approach anyone, the ones with question marks beside their names. He said he'd try. By April, 2 other veterans had started showing up alongside him. A former Air Force crew chief named Dennis, who'd come in with a limp from a bad landing, and left 4 months later with a border collie named Wes who'd once cleared the adoption room on site. A former Army nurse named Judith, still working at the VA, who'd begun sitting outside the kennel of a senior Catahoula mix that had watched 40 volunteers walk past without stopping. The dog's name was Pepper. Judith stopped. Faye named the group Steady Watch, after the naval term for holding a course through uncertain conditions without overcorrecting. The name was Grant's suggestion. The first rule was also his. The dogs were not therapy. The veterans were not damaged handlers looking for a function. They were 2 populations that had survived hard things and had not yet decided what came next, and sometimes proximity to another creature who understood that landscape was enough to begin answering the question. The second rule was phase. Every placement came with a vet evaluation, a behavioral plan, and follow-up visits. Love mattered. Love without preparation was just another form of pressure. One evening in late May, Grant sat at the kitchen table with Ranger stretched out across his boot. A habit the dog had developed and showed no sign of reconsidering, and looked at the gloves on the windowsill in the last of the afternoon light. He thought about Miriam standing at the back fence on a gray March Saturday, looking at mountains she'd never lived near before, and knowing anyway. He thought about Ajax, about the 11 minutes, about the 9 years he had spent believing that everyone who died in his care had taken with them any door that might have opened to something new. He still did not know how to close what had happened. He was no longer certain that closing was the right word. But there was a 70-pound Belgian Malinois sleeping across his foot. There was a south fence he'd mended in the spring. There were Wednesday mornings in Bozeman and 2 veterans who showed up now without being asked, and a dog named Pepper who had finally let Judith touch the top of her gray head and had leaned into the hand like she'd been waiting a long time for someone patient enough to reach that far. Ranger turned in his sleep, exhaled once, and settled deeper. His legs relaxed, his breathing slowed to the even, trusting rhythm of a dog who had stopped holding the watch alone. Grant rested his hand on the dog's side and felt the steady rise and fall beneath his palm. Outside, the meadow held the last of the evening light, and the mountains behind it held theirs a little longer. The way they do in Montana in the long days of late spring, as though the day is reluctant to let go of something good. Inside the farmhouse, in the ordinary quiet of 2 beings who had each believed that what they'd lost had sealed the door to anything that came after. The door remained open. It had been open all along. They had simply needed to stop facing the wrong direction long enough to see it. Sometimes healing does not arrive with clarity or with certainty. Sometimes it comes the way Ranger came across the floor of the farmhouse on a November night, trembling, afraid, choosing to cross the distance anyway. That is not weakness. That is the bravest thing a broken heart can do. If this story found you today, perhaps it is because there is a door somewhere in your own life that is still open, and something on the other side has been waiting for you to notice. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and leave a comment below. We read everyone. God bless you and the ones you love.